Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. I am your political host, Will Wright. I'm joined by my awesome co-host, faithful host, Josh Bertram. He's a pastor. I'm having trouble with English today.
What's up, Will?
Forming structure.
It's all good.
Sentences. I'll figure
Be
this
careful,
out.
dude. Don't you might come under the ire of ice, dude.
I might, yeah. Which, anyways, I won't go on a tangent on that. Joining us today is Dr. Stephen Okey. He is a Catholic theologian and associate professor at St. Leo University, where he teaches courses on theology, ethics, and the intersection of faith and culture. He's got a PhD from Boston College. His work explores theological anthropology, the role of church in public life, and how Catholicism engages with politics, pop culture, and digital media. And we are just so glad to have you with us here today. Can we call you Stephen?
You can call me Steve if you want.
Oh, Steve. Oh, wow. I'm Steve. Have you seen Minecraft?
No, but I have been told I should. But my oldest child is 5, and so we're not quite there yet. And also,
Right.
I don't need her to have like a new obsession. So
that is
Yeah.
true.
I hear
It's
that.
funny. I was asking Josh actually the other day how many times he's heard the Chicken Lava song. Which for those that watch Minecraft will understand that reference, but if you haven't seen it, then you're a much better person than I am. So
I'm still in the bliss of ignorance. So
awesome. Well, yeah. Well, God bless you. Well, thanks so much for coming on our show. We wanted to bring you on to talk about all things Catholicism, all things Pope. It's an area that Josh and I don't really know a whole lot. Right, me less than Josh. So, really appreciate you coming on. But before we kind of dig into it, I'd love to hear about your journey. Like, how does one get into Catholic theology?
That's a great question, and it's been a long and circuitous route for me. I'll say briefly, I grew up in the Midwest. My family, I would say, is fairly waspy, and kind of like a cultural Protestant, non-practicing kind of background. So my mom's parents were Presbyterian, and my dad's mom was a Church of Christ. And so we went to a Presbyterian church when I was a kid, but I don't think it was I think it was more a moral formation thing for my parents than anything else. But they sent my brother and I to the local Jesuit high school because it was, a better school, and I think they thought it would straighten us out a little bit. And from there, I went on to Georgetown, and I was actually a math major at Georgetown, which is a major that I share with the new Pope, which is nice.
Very nice.
But I also, I was really into talking about religion and philosophy, and I kind of fell in with a Catholic crowd, and I started studying theology. We had to take theology courses anyway. And the first theology course I took was just fascinating. And I was like, I'm going to stick with this. And I just love talking about it. And by the time I graduated from Georgetown, I had gone through what was then called RCIA, the Rite of Christian Initiation for Adults, and become Catholic. I got baptized. And then I continued studying for my master's after that. And then I got tired of it, as I think people do. I got tired of being in school, and I had a corporate insurance job for a couple years as a sort of deliberate, almost like sabbatical from study, or my own Rumspringa, or however you want to think about it. And then I went back for my PhD and haven't looked back since.
Wait, so working in the insurance industry is your idea of a Rumspringa?
The thing is,
You're a wild dude.
I know, it's nuts. The office I worked in did computer modeling for like natural disasters and terrorist events and these sorts of things.
Nice.
And like I said, I was a math person, and I love technology, and so that part was fascinating. But really, and like this is the truth of it, was I did my master's degree in Chicago, and when I was finishing up, like I knew I didn't want to go back to school, but I really wanted to stay in Chicago. And so I was only looking for jobs in the city. And I think this is like, I don't know, 2005. I think I applied for every job in the city that, could pay a decent wage. And I had 2 offers, and this one it was like downtown, near the Loop. It was right by Millennium Park. And I was like, I'll do this. And
Nice.
honestly, like I wasn't, I wasn't a broker. I wasn't selling things. I was just trying to, like, figure out problems. I got to do a lot of coding, and it was great. I had a great time. So,
Dude, you springing it up, dude. And
and I mean, let's be honest. Like, I was, a young man in my 20s in Chicago, and I didn't have,
hey,
I didn't have any sort of like real responsibilities. I wasn't married yet or anything like that. But also, it was the first time I was out of college. But I also, like, I had an income, like, and
I
so
know.
one, like, work would finish. We'd be done at 5, and I'd be done. I didn't have to take anything home. I didn't have to think
That's
about
great.
it in the evening. I didn't think about it over the weekend. And so I could do, like, I took classes. I had a great, I learned cooking. I took fiddle. Like, I did all sorts of things. It was great. So,
Dude, that's awesome. It gets better and better the more details I hear. I love it. The good old days, dude. You're gonna get me all jelly here thinking about taking fiddle classes.
it was great. I recommend. I never got good, but I got good enough to enjoy it.
Hey,
So,
dude, that's the only thing that matters. So, I love hearing that about you and some of those personal details. It's cool to kind of fill in, that character and to know a little bit more about what makes you tick. And I think when it comes to theology, like, number one, most people are kind of like, theology, okay, like that sounds, I don't know, probably my guess is most people never think about it. Although they probably think about God, but they don't
sure.
think about theology, that term or that concept. So I would love for you to just kind of, I mean, I guess in one sense, help us get like an operational definition of theology
Sure.
here for our time together, and even like what is, and the thing that kind of burns in my mind, and like the question is burning in my mind, is what's the biggest difference if we're thinking theology between Catholic theology and, like, I don't know, just Protestant theology, other theology. Like,
Sure.
it seems like it's this word that's supposed to define all this stuff, and yet there's so many different directions under it and ways that it goes that it can become confusing, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question, and a sort of good entree. I would say, so the first thing I'd say to the first part of your question is, one of the central, like, go-tos or slogans I think that Catholics often will think about in terms of what theology is the statement from Saint Anselm in the 11th century, which is, theology is faith-seeking understanding. And the idea in that is people often already have, core beliefs or an underlying view of the world, but that's often not something that is, critically reflected on or developed, or and I think this happens for a lot of people, including today. They have sort of the experience of when they were young or when their parents took them to church or whatever else, but it's never really sort of matured, developed, progressed beyond that early stage. Even though the questions, the big questions remain, and in many respects, as we get older, they get, harder or more demanding in some sense, especially as, we enter into relationships or have children or that sort of thing. And so theology is about, trying to understand and make sense of, what one's faith, says, what one's faith calls one to. So that's part of how I would describe it. The other thing I would say, and this is, like, as someone who teaches theology, like, I love to go to, like, the etymology, like, where's the word come from? And just theology, theologos is just really simply, it's words about God, it's understanding of God. And so already, to some extent, when someone is, say, like, when they're praying and they're saying words to God, they're already engaging in theology in a very, visceral and sort of fundamental way. The work that I do, both in terms of my research, but especially in terms of my teaching, is to try to get people to think about, what does that mean? What are the implications of that? How does that connect to other parts of our lives? And what does it tell us about, our view of reality and of the world? I think in making, so to your second question about, Catholic theology, Protestant theology, other theologies, things like that, I think that there's a couple like generic ways of thinking about the differences, and then I'll talk about at least one specific one. The generic thing is that every religious tradition, whether it's Christianity writ large, or it's Roman Catholicism, or it's Presbyterianism, or it's sort of like a Orthodox Judaism, whatever it is, there a central part of understanding the theology is understanding the history of that tradition as well, because part of coming to understand God, and I think this is true for individuals, and I think it's true for communities, is recognizing the work of God in our lives over time, and recognizing the sort of new situations and contexts in which we find ourselves, and how to respond to that in a way that is still faithful. And so when I've taught courses with students and we look at different traditions, one of the things I will say is like, look at the history of the people as well, the things that happened to them and the choices that they made, and how that might shape different responses to certain questions. So that's sort of the generic answer. I think the particular answer I would say is I think that Catholics are often sort of caricaturized as having a weak relationship with the Bible. And some of that is because the Catholic tradition has long emphasized and held the idea of tradition as on kind of the same level as Scripture, that the church is about both Scripture and tradition. So what the church has said before, in the past, carries significant weight. It's not Scripture alone. And that's sort of the default posture I think a lot of people have as an understanding of many, but not necessarily all Protestant traditions, is Scripture alone. Scripture is the foundation, it's the fundamental source, it's the final arbiter of any kinds of questions. So that's one thing that I would say I think is sort of the main kind of distinction. The other one, and I think this probably goes a little bit to what we'll talk about today, is I think in practice, the Catholic Church, because of the role of the Pope, has a sort of stronger sense of unity, sticking together, holding together as one very, very large, very diverse, sometimes very contentious community. But like there's a sort of general resistance among Catholics to going their own way. And at least in my own experience, the diversity of Protestant traditions to some extent speaks to, I think, often a strong sense and conscience that one has to go one's own way in order to like witness to their understanding of the gospel. But because there's not that same sort of principle of unity holding them together, that breakaway is a little bit easier.
When I think about friends of mine that are Catholic, or I hear about things going on in the Catholic Church, I'm still kind of at a loss to find a place to put it, because I've never read a book about Catholicism, so I don't really understand kind of the background or history, or like why why the Catholic Church is just so huge. I mean, I guess one could argue the Christian Church is huge too, but it's just like the Christian Church doesn't have a pope, So could you give us like a bit of history of like how did we get to a place where the Vatican is like this overwhelming like city that Dan Brown writes books and stuff about?
I'll try and give an abbreviated answer, because there's some books I can recommend on this, but it's a long thing. I think one is, different Christian traditions will sort of dispute this claim, so I'm just going to sort of say it, in a tentative way. But Catholics tend to understand like the original Christian church is the Catholic Church, like we're coterminous with that, right? And so one of the principles in Catholic teaching, and you see this in the Nicene Creed, is the idea of the apostolic, like one Catholic apostolic church, right? One holy Catholic and apostolic church. And the apostolic part of that is this belief that the leaders of the church today could trace the line of bishops all the way back to the apostles. So there's this sense of continuity throughout. So that's one piece of it. Obviously, other Christian traditions will say, like, we trace ourselves back to the apostles. Like, so that's not a unique claim of the church, but the apostolic succession part is not unique to Catholicism, but it's a distinctive feature that not all traditions share, right? So the Orthodox share this, the Anglicans share this. I don't know that there are others who do off the top of my head. So that's one piece of it. And so the size of the Catholic Church in that respect is sort of tied to just the expansion of Christianity, over its first millennium in particular. What happens in the 11th century is, one, there's a split between the Eastern and Western churches, which become more or less the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, with some exceptions built into that. And the Western Church, the Catholic Church, is over the subsequent many hundreds of years becomes involved in exploration, colonization, et cetera, et cetera. And so a lot of the areas that we think of as especially places where Catholicism is sort of booming or has been growing in the last several decades are in the global South, which were places that were colonized. And so you think of Latin America, you think of a lot of Africa, the Catholic, and you think also of Asia in some areas, especially like Vietnam, right? The Catholic Church was behind a lot of missionary impulses and supported colonizing efforts. And so that's part of the expansion too. The third thing is, one, I think that for better and for worse, the Catholic Church has a very organized structure to it, a hierarchical structure to it, that gives it, one, a certain sort of enduring institutional quality that helps it to stick around, but that also enables this kind of missionary and evangelical effort in a way that is sometimes, I think, harder for other churches to do. And then lastly, and I think this is the case with some communities, maybe not others, religious communities that are built around sort of particular figures or leaders or pastors or theologians or whatnot, if they have a kind of cult of personality, they often don't survive, the death of that personality. And I think the Catholic Church, at least in perception, if not also in reality, has a certain sort of, it's not about any one pope, any one bishop, any one, great thinker. It's this whole sort of large body of Christ.
That's really helpful to hear that explained so concisely, but I think also pretty comprehensively. I appreciate that. I would love to dig into the Pope a little bit and kind of
Sure.
like, because I think this idea of the Pope is kind of like for a lot of Americans, like, I guess, we were talking a little bit, Will and I, and talking about Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, and how people were concerned, is he going to listen to the Pope or is he going to listen to the people? Or the Pope, this was that's not the first time, right? A Catholic was accused in history of the intention, whether true or not, to listen to the Pope or be the Pope's puppet, essentially.
Yeah.
And do, whatever his bidding is in their situation. And of course, that's really an oversimplification, grossly and inaccurate. And yet it seems like this kind of stuff continues. And I would love for you to kind of help demystify the Pope a little
Sure.
bit for us. Like, what is the Pope's role? Like, is it that everything the Pope says this is what God is saying? Or is it, when is he speaking kind of ex cathedra, that kind of idea, and even defining that for people?
Sure.
Just like help us understand the Pope, so that we're not like almost demythologizing the Pope.
Yeah.
In some sense for us.
So I want to, if I can, I want to start with the first part of what you were saying about, John F. Kennedy and so forth.
Yeah. Please.
Sort of an interesting background to that is, so John F. Kennedy was the first Catholic U.S. president, but he was not the first Catholic major party candidate for president. And so the first guy to get the nomination was Al Smith. And he was a Democrat. He was the governor of New York. He was an immensely popular governor. really successful, generally very well regarded, had been a very successful like state assemblyman beforehand, so forth. And he, I want to say it's 1928, he's a Democratic candidate. And at this time, I mean, again, this is, 100 years ago now. He's a Democrat. He was expecting to do really, really well in a lot of areas of the country, especially in the South, because the South in the 1920s is all Democratic, right? And he gets clobbered in the South. He only wins a handful of states, and it is overwhelmingly clear the reason Al Smith lost is because he was Catholic. And you can look at like the political cartoons of the time, and it's very much a like, Al Smith is a secret puppet of the Pope, and he's going to be a puppet of the bishops. And you're already in a period of, there's been, 50, 60 years of immigration into the U.S., especially from Catholic countries like Ireland and Italy. And so there's a lot of suspicion of Catholics in the U.S. generally. And so he gets absolutely clobbered. And so when JFK runs in 1960, he has to do this very deliberate thing about saying like, yes, I am Catholic, but that's not like a feature of me being president. I would be a president who happens to be Catholic. And so when he gives this speech to the Houston Baptist Ministers Conference, essentially saying like, I'm not a puppet of the Pope. I will do what I would do essentially as a Democrat, not an American, not as a Catholic. And this seems to win people over. But remember, like, I mean, even Kennedy's election is a razor thin victory. And so, yeah, it's been a suspicion in many respects. To your other question about sort of demystifying the Pope, I'd say maybe three things for this. Number one, the part of the Catholic tradition around the papacy and around the office of the Pope is to see the Pope as, number one, the successor of Saint Peter. And so Saint Peter, one of the apostles, one of the first followers of Jesus, there's this fisherman called by Jesus. And there's a part particularly in Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, where Jesus says to him, you are Peter, and it's this Greek, Peter comes from the Greek word for rock. And he says, you are Peter, the rock on which I'll build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And so Catholics have long seen this as a theological claim marking Peter as the leader of the church following the death of Jesus. And so whenever you get like a list of the popes, the first pope is always going to be Peter. And he's, traditionally seen as serving around like 25 to 30 years as pope, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot we can historically critique about that, but that's kind of the theological basis. His role as pope is, one, as leader of the church, but also he's the Bishop of Rome. And so he's the leader of the religious community of Catholics in Rome. And so the Catholic Church, part of our hierarchical structure is we have bishops. Bishops are heads of dioceses. Dioceses are sort of administrative, geographical territories. And so the bishop is the one responsible for teaching and pastoring that whole diocese. And that, in effect, means, they're the supervisor, leader, whatever, for the priests and other religious organizations within that area. And so the Pope, in particular, is the bishop for the Diocese of Rome. So that's a part of the role. That's also a big part why, in history, so many of the popes have been Italians. People are like, why is he always Italian? Well, part of it is he's the Bishop of Rome, historically. There are other reasons, too, but that's one of them. In sort of further demystifying that, the reason the Bishop of Rome is so central is, one, historically, Rome was so central to the Roman Empire and the sort of early period of the church. And so it is the eternal city. It is the imperial capital. It is the place to it, all roads lead to Rome, right? And so there's a certain eminence that comes with being the bishop there. You might imagine, why isn't, say, the Bishop of Jerusalem the head, right? I mean, this is where Christ dies. Like, why is it not that? And Jerusalem has a sort of certain preeminence also as a diocese. This is, noted early in the literature, but it really functionally becomes Rome as a sort of administrative center. But then further, in the early several hundred years of the church, you have bishops all over the Mediterranean and further. And when they have disputes with one another, because this also happens, right? Like Christians dispute with one another. Who would have thought? But when bishops have disputes, they have to have ways of resolving this. And figuring out what is the best interpretation. What is the right way for us to understand who Jesus is? What is the right date for us to celebrate Easter? Like these kinds of questions. And in some cases, bishops will meet together in what are sometimes called synods or sometimes called councils, and they'll discuss, they'll debate, they'll fight, and ultimately they'll vote, and they'll make decisions that way. So that's one way of sort of resolving disputes. But one of the other ways is often appealing to other bishops. And what happened was there were many situations where bishops in the sort of Mediterranean basin would appeal to and ask the Bishop of Rome, like, what do you think on this question? And whether by luck or by providence, the Bishop of Rome's positions on these questions are often the ones that carried the day. They were seen as the orthodox, correct positions. And it created this sort of sense of trust and fidelity, and like, this is the guy we need to appeal to. And it comes to a head. Sorry if this is more detail than you want, but
great. No, keep going.
This is super helpful.
It comes to a head really in a particular way in the 5th century. There's this very famous council called the Council of Chalcedon, which is held in modern day Turkey, and it's this central debate about Christ and how do we understand Christ as human, but also as divine. Like, what is the way that we understand these things? Because you have a real problem. Is there one person, or are there two sort of separate people in some way? Does Christ have a human nature or a divine nature, or both, or some third mixture of the two? Like, how do we reconcile all these kinds of questions? And the Pope at the time is Pope Leo I, Pope Leo the Great, writes this letter. It's called the Tome of Leo, but it's a letter to Flavian, and it's sent to this council. So Leo isn't even at this meeting, but he sends it, and it is read aloud, and he gives this sort of articulation for what it would mean for Christ to have both human nature and divine nature, to be completely, totally, fully human, but also completely, fully, totally divine. Not like a balance or a mix, but completely both, and still be one acting person. And he sends this letter, and it's read at this meeting, and there's just acclamation about how brilliant it is. And one of the bishops says the famous sort of quote, maybe it's apocryphal, but it's something like, Peter has spoken. And so it's just this real like cementing of the Bishop of Rome as this central figure. And so from there, by this time, you're already getting division between the Eastern Church and Western Church. You already have Constantinople, as this major seat, which is, today is the seat of the Greek Orthodox Church. But Rome really becomes the center. The Diocese of Rome, the Bishop of Rome, really becomes the sort of central figure. And he's a bishop like other bishops, but he's seen as like first among equals. And so there's a certain priority that comes with him. Now, lots of development over the next 1,500 years from there. But you have, like, I'm not going to do all of it, but you have, later events like, for example, when Charlemagne is crowned emperor, okay? He's crowned by the Pope, right? So part of his legitimacy as a secular ruler derives from the Bishop of Rome has placed the crown on your head. And that as a sort of ritual is something that continues for centuries. So even 19th century, revolutionary era France, when Napoleon declares himself emperor, he is also crowned by the Pope in Paris. And so that kind of
That's so
signal,
wild, man.
Yeah. And so I think it had a certain symbolic, utility for Napoleon. I don't think it was a deeply felt thing.
But that was a really significant moment when the Pope crowned Charlemagne, right? I mean, that was like, hey, he's the guy who's really in charge kind of thing, correct?
It is. And so the sort of symbolic importance and the hierarchical importance of the Pope is pretty significant. And so, like I mentioned before, I think that it's helpful to see the Pope as not the only, but as one of the sort of like principles of unity that helps hold the Catholic Church together. Some of that is theological, and some of that, honestly, is also just practical. There are lots of not going back to the Reformation, just going back in the last like 150 years. There are lots of offshoots of the Catholic Church. And so there's a branch that after the First Vatican Council in 1870 rejected the idea of papal infallibility, which I know we'll talk about in a moment. And so it's called the Old Catholic Church. They're an offshoot. They're a tiny, tiny, tiny minority. They don't have a lot of adherents, a lot of followers. There's a community called the Society of St. Pius X, who went into schism with the Roman Catholic Church after Vatican II, in part over questions of liturgy, but also especially over issues with the Church's position on other religious traditions. And they're sort of better known in some respects, but they're still a tiny, tiny, tiny offshoot. And so there's I think a sense, often maybe implicit, not fully realized, that if you want to have a sort of stake in things, you want to have a role in things, you stay part of the Catholic Church, even within the tensions within that, rather than sort of break off and go your own way.
Interesting. So,
this is just so fascinating, dude.
It really is.
I mean, I'm like sitting here, I'm just like, you're just talking, and I'm like, man, there's so many questions are coming up in my mind, so many ideas, and just sorry. Go ahead, Will. It's just amazing.
So about papal or papal,
yeah,
papal. That too. Are popes infallible? Like, can they make a mistake? And if they do, like, what?
Sure.
Do they get fired or something?
Okay, so
and who fires them?
Yeah. God. So popes have infallibility. Popes also make mistakes, and it's important to recognize like the sort of like the jurisdiction of those things. Okay. So part of the understanding of the Catholic Church around questions of teaching and so forth is that there are particular situations and ways in which the Church can speak infallibly, and that what the Church says is in fact true, and will be held as such. And the idea is that those kinds of interventions it's not just a bunch of people doing something. It's guided by the Holy Spirit, and that going back to this idea that like the gates of hell will not prevail against the Church, the Holy Spirit is not going to allow the Church to err in fundamentally important ways. Okay, so to go back like very far back, right? I just mentioned the Council of Chalcedon, and the sort of resolution of the Council of Chalcedon is to say that in Christ he is both fully human and fully divine, and that is true without any kind of separation or division, but also without any confusion or changing, right? And so these two things are held together, and the term for this is a hypostatic union. And it's not a third thing. It's not like a human divine hybrid, like the demigods of Greek myth, but it's both. When the council met, when the bishops voted, the belief is that this is an infallible act, and it's in this case, it's an example of speaking infallibly about faith, about the beliefs of the Church. There's been, I want to say, 21 councils of the Church, from Nicaea in 325 to Vatican II, that ended in 1965. And so the sort of faith, the particular faith claims and the particular morals claims of these are seen to be they should be held as definitively true. The Pope also has the capacity to act infallibly or to speak infallibly. And in doing so, it's the same idea that, one, the Holy Spirit is not going to allow the Pope to just get up and say infallibly, I don't know, the Pacers should have won the NBA Finals, which I'll be honest, I believe it didn't happen. It was very heartbreaking watching that game in the second half. That kind of thing, like if Pope Leo really wanted to do it, the Holy Spirit would not allow it in some sense, I think is the sort of underlying belief. the reality of papal infallibility is, and it's often held as this sort of thing, the doctrine, the dogma, the teaching that the Pope is infallible was declared by the First Vatican Council in 1869, 1870. And so the idea has some history beyond that. Like, it's not like a new insight in 1870. There's a real debate about it, but it's actually declared then. And actual exercises, like moments where the Pope has spoken ex cathedra, which means from the chair, like from the chair of St. Peter, has happened twice. It's happened 2 times. And so this is not a regular occurrence. And the two times it has happened, I'm not gonna get the years right, but I'm gonna get the decade right. So one is in, I think it's the 1840s or 1850s. And it's when Pope Pius IX declares ex cathedra infallibly that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was immaculately conceived. Okay. And the idea of the Immaculate Conception, this comes up periodically, is not about Jesus being immaculately conceived. It's Mary. And so when Mary's parents, traditionally known as Joachim and Anne, conceive her, that is an act without sin. Mary is without sin, and Mary, throughout her life, lives without sin. Okay, this is another place where I think Catholics and Protestants sometimes want to go a different direction. We have a very high regard for Mary in this respect. So this is one. Mary is immaculately conceived. Now, this is also an idea, a teaching that goes back to the early centuries of the church. It wasn't a brand new idea. And it was popularly held by huge swaths of Catholics, particularly in Europe in the 19th century. And it was really, in a certain sense, it wasn't like they all wrote letters to the Pope saying, do this, but there was this sense of sort of like more or less universal consensus on this idea. Okay, so it wasn't the Pope like pushing against the tides or anything else. It was sort of a recognition. That's one. The second one is in the 1950s, and it's Pope Pius XII. And he declares infallibly from the chair of St. Peter that Mary, again, same Mary, was assumed bodily into heaven. This is called the Assumption of Mary. Okay. Huh. And the idea of this, if you sort of track, some of the theology, is if Mary was without sin her entire life, and the wages of sin is death, then it doesn't make sense for Mary to just die, right? Unless she's, murdered or killed in some sense, which the tradition has never held. And so the idea is that Mary doesn't die. Mary is assumed bodily into heaven. The end of her earthly life is not death. It's assumption. Again, widely held popular belief, long for centuries and centuries discussed. The sort of Eastern Orthodox version of this is a little different. It's called the Dormition of Mary, which is essentially that Mary fell asleep and remains asleep until, I think, the resurrection, until the eschaton. I'm not as solid on that one.
Poor Mary.
Yeah. But doesn't have to die, right? Like doesn't experience the pain and separation of death, right? These are the 2 times. The 2 times the Pope has exercised papal infallibility are both dogmatic claims about the Virgin Mary. So it's and which are always, in some sense, are about Jesus. They're not like there's always that piece of it theologically, but the Pope has not weighed in infallibly on any kind of like public policy issues, has never weighed in infallibly about wars, has never weighed in infallibly about liturgical practices, right? Those things have always really been done on the infallible part by the work of councils. And so, yeah, so this, like, there's this idea that like, this came up a lot during the papacy of Pope Francis, who was the previous
Like everything
Pope.
the Pope tweets is infallibly for
all his
ex
tweets
cathedra.
are... He would do these press conferences on the plane when he was flying back from somewhere, and people would ask him questions, and there would always be, wild things that would come out of this. And for people who are sort of like, oh, the Pope must be infallible. Well, if he's making boo-boos on the plane, like then that makes them question infallibility. But the key to understand is it's a very narrowly exercised power. It's rare that it's done. 2, there's a real sense of like a formula almost to it, where the Pope has to say like, I am speaking from the chair of St. Peter on faith and morals. Like I am very clearly, explicitly making an infallible claim. There's no question about it, right? It should be pretty clear. And in the two cases it's been done, these were not controversies really within the church. There are absolutely Catholics who are, don't believe these things or are suspicious of them. I mean, there's Catholics who have all sorts of issues with all sorts of things. But it wasn't like the Pope said either of these and the Catholic faithful were like, oh, no, how could you do that? Like, these were often already aspects of popular piety.
I am curious, just real quick question. I learned when the new Pope was sworn in, I don't know if that's the right term, probably not. But when the new Pope was chosen, that's not their real name. Like Pope Leo wasn't born Pope Leo. Can you explain that? Like why are they not using their real names, and who are these people that they're named after?
Yeah, it's a great question with a lot of also fun history behind it. Most popes for centuries have taken a name when they were elected. Okay. The first pope to do this, I don't remember exactly when. It was like 4th or 5th century. It was a long time ago. And the reason he took a papal name, and I forget which name he took, but his birth name was like Mercurius. And so his birth name was a pagan god. And so he took a new name so that the leader of the church, the Bishop of Rome, would not have a pagan name. So that's the sort of first, story of that. And so, so the current Pope Leo XIV, his birth name is Robert Prevost. He's, from Chicago. So there's a whole thing with him being the first American Pope too. But he took the name Leo, and he has specifically said in his case, that he took the name Leo, essentially in honor or kind of in line with, Leo XIII. And Leo XIII was the Pope from 1878 to 1903. 25-year papacy, really influential, really important in a lot of respects.
Real fast. Pope Leo XIII, was that his real name?
No, his name. Oh gosh, I've forgotten what his name is. Yeah, I don't remember. It was not Leo. I want to say he was Giuseppe Pecci, but that might be someone after.
We won't hold you to it.
It's okay. Any listeners who want to know, just look on Wikipedia. It'll tell you. So I think it's probably been at least 500 years since there was a pope who did not take another name. And typically what's happening when popes take other names, and recent popes have been even more explicit about this, is there's a particular prior pope that they're honoring, or that whose tradition they want to continue in some respect. Or in the case of Francis, who's really the sort of first unique name in centuries, he specifically took that name out of reference to St. Francis of Assisi. And there was one of the when Cardinal Bergoglio, which was his name at the time, when he was elected, one of the other cardinals nearby him essentially said, like, don't forget the poor. Like, that was his sort of, advice to the new pope. And that seemed to be what motivated him to take the name Francis. But others, for example, Benedict XVI, who was the pope prior to Francis, took his name after Benedict XV. And Benedict XV, Benedict XV and also Benedict of Nursia. So I'll get to him in a second. Benedict XV was the Pope during World War I. And he was elected a few months into World War I. And so he's, the leader of the Catholic Church in a period where, like, the church really still thinks of itself as very European. And he sees all these European nations lining up and killing each other. And Benedict XV calls World War I like the civilizational suicide of Europe. Like, that's how he sees it. And he tries desperately to get them to negotiate and stop the war. He tries desperately to help out refugees and orphans of the war. He nearly bankrupts the Vatican spending money to make this possible. Benedict was so committed to trying to stop that war, and was often seen as a failure because he didn't, which I don't think at all is fair to him. I think he was a phenomenal person. And so Benedict XVI really wanted to honor Benedict XV's commitment to trying to sort of save Europe in a sense. But then also Benedict of Nursia, Saint Benedict, who's the founder of the Benedictine order, writes the Rule of Saint Benedict. And the Benedictine monks are really seen as, sort of central carriers of the Catholic tradition throughout, the early medieval period and the late medieval period, the formation of monasteries and abbeys and libraries and all sorts of things. So,
real fast on the Benedictine monks. When I was in high school, I had a CD called the Benedictine Monks of Santo Domingo
de Silos. Yep.
Yeah.
Everybody had that CD.
It was like chanting or something. Yeah, I loved it.
It was great. Yeah. That's the Benedictines. And part of, they don't invent Gregorian chant per se, but they're really associated with it. And so my university is a historically Benedictine university, and we have an abbey of monks, and they still do Gregorian chant during their daily prayers and during mass and so forth. So, so let me talk just briefly, I guess, about Leo. So Leo the 13th, I think the fourth longest pope in history, right? So just really long reign. And actually his predecessor, Pius IX, was the longest. So he was pope, I think, for 31 years, just this insane, period of time. Maybe 33, somewhere in there. And one of the things that is really important for understanding Leo the 13th, and that is really important for understanding why Leo the 14th took this name. If you think about sort of the late 19th century, and you think about sort of especially what was going on in Europe at the time, you have the sort of like the fruits of the Industrial Revolution really coming to bear. So you have, a lot of urbanization. You have a lot of people moving into cities. So you have all the sorts of housing and health issues that come with that kind of concentration. You have a lot of issues for families in terms of a change in the form of labor. You have children laboring, not out on farms, but in factories. And you have, for many people, as much as there's this sort of general, country making economic progress and all that sort of thing, for many of the people, it's just misery. And drudgery, and you have all sorts of accidents. You have, very few worker protections. You have efforts at unionization are often stymied, sometimes violently. And amid all of this, you also have, in part because of this Industrial Revolution, you have the rise of socialism as a sort of response to these, economic and political problems. And so Leo the 13th looks at this changing landscape, this changing world, and he writes this encyclical. The Latin title, which is what everyone knows it by, is Rerum Novarum, and the English title is usually something like on the laboring classes in capital or something like that. But what Rerum Novarum translates to is like of the new things, right? He's talking about these new things that are going on. And in this encyclical, he really emphasizes, Leo XIII really emphasizes the dignity of work and the dignity of laborers, and how work it's an important part of being a human being. It's part of how we participate in God's creation in the world, that, private property is important for the flourishing of people in this life. And he rejects the sort of, Marxist socialist idea that there should be conflict between the classes, that the capital classes who own the means of production and the laboring classes who work them should work harmoniously and not, be at loggerheads with one another. And he puts a lot of the responsibility of this at the capital classes, like, has expectations of, their solicitude towards their workers. And what happens in this encyclical is it's really this first significant instance of the Pope and of the Catholic Church weighing in on a social question, an economic, political question, in a way that is seen as supposed to be guiding for, the rest of the world. And so we often talk about it as the first major text of Catholic social teaching, right? It's the one that sort of inaugurates this long tradition of especially popes weighing in when there's some kind of problem or challenge or even catastrophe that calls for guidance, but is not just about individual persons need to make better choices. It's about concerns about the larger social systems that organize the choices that people make. And so when Leo XIV, speaks in the first couple of weeks of his papacy about why he chose his name, he always goes back to Leo XIII. He always goes back to Rerum Novarum in particular, this encyclical. And then he always connects that to artificial intelligence. And for Leo XIV, he really seems to see artificial intelligence as this kind of new industrial revolution, at least potentially so. He seems to see it as something that has potentially great impact on the dignity of work, on the work that people do, the sort of regard, and then also the dignity of human persons in general. And so that seems to be a real top of mind issue for him. There's pretty wide expectation that he will release an encyclical, so a teaching letter about artificial intelligence. I think he very well might do it in the next year. It might be his first encyclical, but that seems to be the sort of, for him, the thing that really drives the choice of his name.
And the idea is like, hey, we are on the cusp of, and really into a very, like, in a revolution of work, and there are going to be people that need advocacy because they're going to lose their jobs, kind of thing, like that. Like there's just going to need to be a lot of focus on this because of how much it is going to disrupt the potential it has to disrupt economies, things like that.
I think that's a part of it. And so we can definitely anticipate, major technological changes have impacts. People lose jobs, all those sorts of things. And so that's going to be, I think, a part of it. I think that there's also a lot of questions and concerns people have, not just about, will we lose jobs or things like that, which, again, I mean, I as someone who works in college, like, I have a lot of concerns about artificial intelligence and, its use by students, but also its use by other faculty and administrators, and what that means for the work that we do. So there's like that piece, right, where like many others, I'm always a little worried about my job. But I think the deeper piece of it, too, is going to be around questions of human dignity. And one of the things, and I have a friend who says this a lot, whenever, if you're on social media or whatever, and people like to share, AI generated images of things. And so if you want, a picture of whatever, you can just ask ChatGPT or someone else, make this, and you can tweak and everything else. But there's concerns about, like, that's like maybe helpful if you need a logo quickly or something, but like, it's not really art. Like, there's not a human dimension to it in the same way. There's something kind of soulless about it. It's a similar thing with a lot of writing. And I think about with my students, like, I don't need essays. Like, I don't have like a lack of essays in my office. And so I'm like hiring them to make them. I want them to think, like, I want them to be critical. And this is one of the sort of, efficient ways of doing that. And if they give me an AI generated paper, like, there's no human effort on their part to think about it, right? It's just like checking a task off their to-do list. And so I think that there's a lot of concern in AI about, can it, will it, how will it contribute to a sort of like a less human, a dehumanization in society? And I think that that's one of the things that he'll also be probably sort of looking to and addressing.
That makes a lot of sense. When we're thinking about the Pope getting like chosen, there's a lot of mystery around that, and the smoke, and it's black smoke and it's white smoke or whatever. I obviously I'm exposing my ignorance. And like, what's going on there? Like, is it like they're drawing, and whoever draws like the short straw, they're the Pope? I know that's being silly, but like, what's kind of the process, and why is it so mysterious?
Sure. So process wise, the people who get to vote on who the next Pope will be, one, they have to be cardinals. And so a cardinal is a particular position in the church. Cardinals are selected by popes. And they remain cardinals until, unless it's taken away from them, which has rarely happened, but does happen. And in terms of the sort of rules around conclave, so the conclave is the election of the new pope, they have to be under the age of 80 when the papal seat becomes vacant. So whether the Pope dies, or as in the case of Benedict XVI, when he resigns. You have to be under the age of 80 when that happens. So if you turn 80 between the death of the Pope and the conclave, you still get to participate. And the idea on that is, in large part, a sense that at a certain age, basically it's time to retire and let the younger 70 somethings make decisions at that point. The process then is they're sequestered. So their phones are taken away. They don't interact with anybody other than the other cardinals and the sort of people who are there to help with meals and all that sort of thing, right? Like they don't know what's going on in the outside world for, honestly, generally the couple of days this takes. This is no longer a process that takes weeks, months, years. Historically, there were conclaves that lasted years. Part of why, in fact, they're locked in. And so the conclave with a key, means with a key, they're locked into the Sistine Chapel for the votes, is historically, it was to force them to make a decision. It used to be that when conclaves went longer and longer and longer, they would be more restrictive about the quality of the food. There was one conclave 700 years ago where they literally removed the roof of the building they were in so that they were not protected from the elements as a way to sort of pressure them in decition making. That's not an issue anymore.
Was it kind of like vacation? They're getting pampered and they're like, I kind of like this conclave thing. I'm not gonna get this up too early.
I think that was probably a part of it, but also, there were real sort of factions and difficulties, and especially there were often a smaller college of cardinals who were voting. And so there were conclaves where as few as 12 or 15 cardinals were deciding. And in general, in most cases, with some exceptions, the person who becomes Pope is someone who's in the room. It's very rare. It can be other people, but it's very rare that it's not one of the voting cardinals. And so even then, it's how are the sort of parties kind of working to one another? Can someone get past a certain number of votes? To win the papal election, you have to get 2/3 of the voting cardinals who vote for you. And so that's a fairly high bar. It's not a simple majority. And so you have to sort of be able to get past, any particular ceiling you might have. One of the things, especially journalists do leading up to a conclave is they figure out who are the candidates, who are the possibility, they might have a chance. They're called papabili, which it just translates to popeable, which is adorable. Is who are the people who have that chance, but also what is their kind of ceiling for support? Are they going to top out at 30, 40 votes? Could they get to 70? That kind of thing. And then usually, and so then the voting process, they come into this room. The first day they do one vote. Everybody has a little note card, and on it says in Latin, I elect for the Supreme Pontiff, and then you put the name. And everybody has this card, and they fill out their little card, and one by one, they walk up to the front desk. They make an oath that they genuinely believe this is the guy. They put it in the ballot. What is it? It's not a ballot box, but it's effectively a ballot box. And then once all those are in, there are 3 cardinals selected at random to count them, and they get the one. They say the name. Everyone hears it. They keep track. They tie them all together with string, and at the end of that, if someone has 2/3. They go and ask him, do you accept? So at that point, Guy could say no. I don't know. It hasn't happened in hundreds of years. It's probably happened at least once in the past. More likely what happens is a cardinal who sees that they have a chance of winning and doesn't want to be Pope will just tell everyone, I will say no, and they'll stop voting for him. They won't elect someone just to be, cheeky about it. And once the guy says, I accept, they then ask, what name will you be called by? And that's when they give the papal name. If they don't get 2/3, the ballots are burned. This is where the smoke comes from. There's a special chimney that's installed in the Sistine Chapel just for this purpose. And it has, in addition to the ballots, there are chemicals that they pump into it so that it is clearly black or clearly white. And if it's black, it means no election. The second day, they come back, they'll do up to 2 ballots in the morning. They'll do up to 2 ballots in the afternoon. They'll do that for however many days essentially it takes. This most recent election was the 4th ballot, which is fairly quick. So Pope Francis was elected on the 5th. Benedict XVI was on the 4th, but John Paul II in 1878 was the 8th. Which again, eighth ballot is like day 3. It's not, months and years of this. So that's kind of the process for it. A lot of why it's secretive. One is really to protect the freedom of the cardinals, to try to limit any kind of external influence on them. And in fact, my understanding is even in canon law in the Catholic Church, a cardinal who is like clearly influenced by, say, like their king or their president or whatever, can be excommunicated, can be punished by the church for that. Because long ago there was a sort of de facto veto that Catholic monarchs could exercise on the election of a pope. And so this happened. The last time this happened was actually 1903. And I don't remember the name of the cardinal, but there was a cardinal who was like on the way to winning. And I want to say it was the Emperor of Austria, but I might be wrong about that, who essentially said no to one of his cardinals, who communicated that to everybody else. And then that guy was done. That guy didn't get elected. And the cardinal who was elected, who became Pius X, immediately made that an excommunicable offense. Did not want that to ever happen again. And there was a moment in the 1914 conclave where it was where they thought it was possible the man who became Benedict XV would be vetoed, but that didn't happen. So,
my last question for you, and to be honest, I can keep talking to you because one thing the audience doesn't know is like Josh and I run off like a list of questions we generally send all of our guests just to make sure that we're kind of in sync. And I sent you a list of, I don't know, probably 20 questions or something. And like we've only gotten to like 2.
I know.
Because all the things you're saying, I'm like, oh, but I wonder about this. Like we haven't even gotten into exorcisms or anything like that. So we're gonna have to bring you back. But I want to ask you just something just kind of more personal, because
sure.
We do cover Christian nationalism. We do cover church-state separation quite a bit. Currently in Washington State, there is a bill about having to have clergy members report like child abuse cases, even in like confidential religious confessions or whatnot. My general view is I'm for religious liberty, so I'm kind of of the view let churches be churches. But I don't know much about confessions or the confidential agreement, so I don't really necessarily have a good opinion about this particular case. So if you can maybe just talk a little bit about talk about as much as you feel comfortable. You don't necessarily have to get into the legalese of the church state constitutional sort of aspect, but just about what it would mean, for a clergy member should this bill pass there in Washington State.
Sure. I mean, it would be a disaster in a real way. And so part of the theology and the spirituality behind confession in the Catholic Church is that the penitent, right, like the person coming for confession and has something to unburden themselves and does so like in good faith, like this is a genuine effort at like confessing one's sins and making penance and all that sort of thing. And that the priest who hears that confession is essentially a mediator, right? Is acting on behalf of Christ, right? And so, for example, and this is like a kind of a technical thing, the priest does not forgive the person who is saying their confession. They'll say like they can absolve them, right? But it's really Christ who forgives our sins, okay? And the idea is this practice of confession is utterly private. The priest is under an obligation to reveal nothing of the confession, to the point that you could ask a priest, did so-and-so go to confession? And the priest can't even tell you that, right? Like that, like they can't even say so-and-so came to confession. Okay. And this is true regardless of the sins that are being confessed. It is regardless of the sort of potential imminence of those sorts of things. Now, the priest can absolutely counsel the penitent to come forward, to go to the police, to do that sort of thing. But number one, you can't make a person's confession dependent upon some other person. Okay. So for example, like if you went to confession and you were confessing you had an affair, the priest cannot require you as a fact of penance to then tell your wife that you had an affair. He can tell you should really do that, but he can't make your absolution dependent on another person. And so,
or tell your husband, I should say,
or whatever it might be. Yeah. Like that's that's long been a feature of our understanding of confession, is that like there's this sanctuary idea to it. Okay. If a bill in Washington or anywhere else were to compel priests to reveal what was told in confession, what I expect would happen is the vast majority, if not all priests, would refuse to do so, and would pay fines, go to jail, whatever it would be. But I think that they would just refuse. I think the bishops of the church in the U.S. would absolutely weigh in and try to push against it. I assume the bishops in Washington are already in Washington State are already trying to do that. I don't know a lot about this particular case, but yeah, it would be. I fully understand the desire that if you have, like, if there's someone who knows something and there's a way that you can get them to tell you, I can understand the desire for that. But it's just simply contrary to the history of Catholic practice and thinking on this to allow for that.
Yeah. And it's such a tough, it's a tough issue to take a stern side on, because on one side you're like, well, what about the children, but then you're like, well, what about church state separation? And it's very difficult. And I appreciate you trying to help us better understand kind of the way that we view about this. But so what else are you working on? You're like a treasure trove of Catholic information. Are you writing this down in what they call books, and selling them?
I will say it's been kind of an interesting couple of months. The communications office at my university, when Pope Francis first fell ill several months ago, had said to me essentially, like, can you be ready, to talk to, the news and everything else if something happens? And I was like, all right. And so, I when Pope Francis died, I was on all the local TV stations and everything else. I've been doing podcasts, through the conclave and the election, and this. And so, it's been a lot of fun for me to be able to talk about a lot of the sort of extra trivia that I think, especially in like a long form like this, which I really appreciate, you can get into. I'm going to be honest, like Channel 8 here in Tampa did not want, my long excursus on anything.
Can you boil everything down to 5 seconds?
They want sound bites, which I like, fair enough, right? That's, what they need. But I have thought a lot about, is there like a good short book on the papacy, that would be like a helpful thing for especially non-Catholics, something like that. So I've thought a little bit about that. The other thing I work on, and this is part of why I'm so interested in Leo in particular, is, and you mentioned this in the intro, is I have a lot of interests in theology and technology and artificial intelligence, and some of those are very sort of practical questions about teaching or about environmental impacts, those kinds of things. But also a lot of it is, for me, sort of like speculative, questions about like agency or consciousness or that sort of thing. Because we have all these debates about, like what can, like, is an AI actually reasoning, or can it do things or whatever else? And I think it's a fantastic opportunity really for people to think about, well, what does it mean when humans have, consciousness or agency, or, when we think about ourselves as persons, like how can this technology, in a sense, kind of mirror back to us, like our big, deep questions about ourselves. And so that's sort of what I've been working on a bit. And then also just this, sort of larger question about, theological engagement with like public life and reflection on public life, and how is that being affected by, AI, but a lot of other digital things. And so, questions about like digital surveillance and big data, those kinds of things. I have a lot of questions about that as well that I'm working on. So
that's really, really cool. Well, thank you so much for coming by and speaking with us, Steve. Really, really appreciate it. This is great.
Thanks for having me. This is a lot of fun for me.
Yeah. So. And if I will put links. Do you have links? You have like stuff that you want to direct traffic to? And this is kind of the part of the show where we're like, hey, like sell yourself, like
sure,
get the clicks.
Yeah, I write a Substack, and so the Substack is, I think the website is stephenokey.substack.com. Whatever that is. The title of it is Okey Doxy. So
love it.
Okey Doxy. Yeah. Working on a logo for that currently. But yeah, I write about theology and technology. I have a podcast where I interview theologians, kind of inconsistently. But yeah, that's really where the place to find me. So
that's really, really cool. Well, we will make sure we put all those links in our show notes. And to our audience, hey, thanks again for stopping by. Make sure you like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, as Josh likes to say, to hack the algorithm. Although I'm not really sure if that hacks the algorithm. You have to eat quantity, really, is what you need, and we don't really have that. But it doesn't matter. We do this because we like it. So like and subscribe, if nothing else, just to make us feel good. But thanks again for stopping by, and as always, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. And we'll see you next time. Take care.